Hi, my name is Glenn Weinreb, and today we're going to talk about how much it would cost to actually build a 100% green electrical power grid in the United States. This is part 2 of our climate solution video series. I have published dozens of articles on how to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. However, only a few methods reduce large amounts at relatively low costs. These typically include building more solar farms, more land-based wind farms, and more hydroelectric dams. When they come online, they produce electricity, and this causes less coal and less natural gas to be burned at nearby electrical power plants. And when less fossil fuel is burned, less carbon dioxide gas is emitted into atmosphere. Okay, but build at what rate? Approximately 40% of U.S. electricity is currently made without emitting carbon dioxide, and President Biden wants it to be 100% by the year 2035. This would entail advancing 60% over 12 years, or 5% per year. To do this, the U.S. would need to build more solar farms, more wind farms, etc. Okay, so that's what President Biden wants. Now let's look at what he has. The U.S. grid is currently decarbonizing at approximately 1/5 his target rate. More specifically, green electricity, as a percentage of total, advances approximately 1% per year in the United States. China is advancing at a similar rate. Germany, on the other hand, is decarbonizing more quickly. Their green electricity, as a percentage of total, advanced approximately 5% per year. For example, they recently advanced from 30% to 50% over 4 years. They are one of the few countries that are likely to reach zero carbon dioxide emissions by the year 2050. Okay, so that's electricity. Now let's look at all energy produced in the United States. This includes things like burning gasoline for transportation and burning natural gas in industrial processes. According to the U.S. government, 20% of all energy consumed was green in 2019 and 21% in 2022, 3 years later. In other words, the U.S. advanced 1% over 3 years. At this rate, it would take the United States 240 years to get to zero emissions from all energy sources. Okay, let's get back to electricity. If the United States did what President Biden wants and fully decarbonized the U.S. electrical power grid by 2035, how much would it cost? We will first examine one U.S. home and then look at the entire United States. And to make this easier to follow, we will work with typical numbers and approximations. On most home electric bills, electricity consumption is specified in units of kilowatt hours, or kWh for short. Vacuuming for an hour consumes approximately 1 kilowatt hour of electricity, for example. The typical U.S. home consumes 10,000 kilowatt hours each year at 14 pennies each, for a total of $1,400 a year. This is retail cost, and this covers electricity generation and distribution. Generation refers to making electricity at the power plant, and distribution refers to the network of power wires between power generation plants and buildings. Typically, 7 pennies goes to generation and 7 pennies goes to distribution. That's retail generation plus distribution. Now let's look at wholesale generation. This is what it costs to generate a large volume of electricity delivered to the front gate of a power generation plant. Wholesale generation is typically 3 pennies per kilowatt hour when working with coal or natural gas, and most of this pays for the fuel. Now let's assume a nearby solar farm produces electricity too. However, it costs a little more. It typically costs 4 pennies. When the sun shines, the consumer pays 4 pennies for green electricity, and they save approximately 3 pennies due to not buying fossil fuel. Ultimately, the consumer pays an additional 1 penny for the green electricity. And when the sun goes down, the consumer is back to 3 penny carbon-based electricity. These are typical wholesale numbers. However, the homeowner sees retail numbers. In our example, retail costs would be 14 pennies for carbon-based electricity and 1 penny more for solar farm electricity. The difference is small because the cost of grid wires and billing systems does not change when you flip between green and non-green sources. And again, you don't pay for natural gas or coal fuel when using green sources. Approximately 40% of U.S. electricity is already green and 60% is fossil fuel-based. This means 40% is currently made by solar, wind, hydro, or nuclear, and 60% is made by coal or natural gas. The house consumes approximately 10,000 kilowatt hours each year, and 60% of this is carbon-based. This works out to 6,000 kilowatt hours that need to be replaced with green electricity. In other words, the homeowner is looking at paying an additional 1 penny for 6,000 kilowatt hours each year. This works out to $60 a year, since 1 penny times 6,000 is $60. However, this does not occur in year 1 since it takes time to build new infrastructure. If one replaces 60% of electricity over 12 years, for example, then 5% would be replaced each year. In other words, 45% would be green after year 1, 50% after year 2, etc. Ultimately, the homeowner would see an additional cost of $5 during year 1, $10 during year 2, and $60 during year 12. Notice the homeowner does not reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Instead, the power company does it. The homeowner just pays the additional cost. If the additional cost was 2 pennies instead of 1 penny, the cost numbers shown in this table would be twice as high. Now let's apply this to the entire United States. One might think of the U.S. as a big house that consumes 4 trillion kilowatt hours each year. 39% of this 4 trillion goes to residential buildings, 35% to commercial buildings, and 26% to industrial facilities. If the entire United States decarbonized in the same way as our typical house, it would cost $2 billion during the first year, $4 billion during the second year, and so forth and so on. This is because 4 trillion times 5% times 1 penny is 2 billion. One can divide these national costs by population to calculate costs per person per year. This works out to $6 per person for year 1, $12 for year 2, etc. Notice we are talking about cost per person per year for all electricity, whereas previously we looked at cost per house per year for residential electricity. Again, we're looking at the additional cost of the green electricity. Our example assumed green electricity costs 1 penny more than the carbon-based fuel it replaces. However, in practice, the cost of green electricity and the cost of the fuel it replaces varies. For example, fuel prices vary over time and between regions, and the cost of solar farm and wind farm electricity vary depending on region. This is because some regions are more sunny and others are more windy. And electricity from solar panels costs less in regions that are more sunny, and electricity from windmills costs less in regions that are more windy. As shown in these maps, the U.S. Southwest is more sunny, and the central U.S. is more windy. Now let's look at actual solar farm cost numbers to get a better sense of how this works. The table on the left shows the cost of electricity from solar farm as a function of region, and the tables on the right show the cost of fuel that is not burned when one switches over. To calculate the approximate additional costs of green electricity, one subtracts the cost of fossil fuel from the cost of green electricity. In other words, one subtracts a red number from a green number. A typical difference is 1 penny. However, as one can see from these tables, the actual difference varies. One can also do this with wind power. The table on the left shows the cost of electricity from windmills as a function of region. And, as one can see, solar farm and land-based wind farm costs are similar. Green energy projects are funded in the same way that non-green energy projects are funded. That is, The original construction is paid for with a loan, and the loan is repaid with revenue from the project. In other words, the green cost numbers in the previous tables are mostly mortgage payments for original construction. We talked about solar and wind, yet what about other sources? This chart shows wholesale costs of green electricity in the United States from different sources in units of pennies per kilowatt hour. And in most cases, land-based wind farms and solar farms are the lowest cost options. However, this is not always the case. For example, nuclear power in China and hydroelectric power in eastern Canada are also low cost. Power companies and electricity markets provide electricity at the lowest cost. However, as mentioned in previous videos, they will not go green at large scales unless required by government. You may have heard that green electricity costs are decreasing. This is true, but by how much? The graph shown here is an estimate of cost versus time by the United States National Renewable Energy Laboratory. They expect solar farms and land-based wind farms to continue to be the lowest cost sources in the U.S. for many decades. Okay, but will this save us from climate change? According to U.S. Department of Energy economists, the answer is no. Shown here is their projection of carbon dioxide emissions from all energy sources over the next 30 years. And this takes into consideration the expected decrease in green electricity costs. And as one can see, they do not expect carbon dioxide emissions to decrease significantly. To better understand this, we need to look at green electricity economics. The difference in the cost of a green product and a non-green equivalent is often referred to as the green premium. In our example, this was 1 penny per kilowatt hour. When I was in college, I took 5 economics courses, and I recall professors stating that understanding costs was at the heart of business. With climate, costs are confusing. This is because the cost to go green is the difference between two costs, in other words, the green premium. To add to the confusion, the green premium can be represented in different units. For example, it can be described as pennies per kilowatt hour, as done in our previous example, or it can be described in units of dollars needed to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide. This latter parameter is sometimes referred to as decarbonization cost. The table shown here enables one to convert between these two units. In other words, convert from pennies per kilowatt hour to dollars per ton of carbon dioxide reduced. For example, if you replace coal-based electricity with solar farm-based electricity, and the green premium is 2 pennies per kilowatt hour, then decarbonization cost works out to $20 per ton of carbon dioxide. When building a solar farm, land-based wind farm, hydroelectric dam in Canada, or nuclear power plant in China, decarbonization costs are typically between $10 and $50 per ton of carbon dioxide reduced. However, many other so-called climate remedies have higher decarbonization costs. This has enormous implications since many lawmakers will not support a program that costs more than $50 per ton when carbon dioxide can be reduced for less. Also, this means that electrical power, in effect, blocks the decarbonization of other areas of the economy that have higher decarbonization costs. This includes things like industrial processes and U.S. transportation. Due to political constraints, we can do some decarbonization in these other areas, yet not at large scales. For this reason, a nation might decarbonize the electrical power grid quickly so there is time to decarbonize other areas of the economy and still get to zero emissions 30 years from now. In other words, to get to zero 30 years from now, one might first decarbonize electrical power over approximately 10 years, and then decarbonize other areas with higher decarbonization costs over the remaining 20 years. This is why President Biden is pushing for a fully green grid by 2035. And this is why Germany is on track to do just that. Okay, so let's review electrical power decarbonization. Currently, most nations are not reducing carbon dioxide emissions at large scales. To change this, they would need to enact new laws that require switching over. To get political support for these, they would probably need to focus on areas that have low decarbonization costs, such as electrical power. To help lawmakers understand the costs and impact of their options, they need better tools maintained by their own economists. We will talk more about these tools in future videos. According to the math, climate change does not need to be difficult. For more climate solution videos, visit the link shown here. Thank you for listening.